Rachel Reeves has come up with what might possibly be the worst idea to fund affordable housing. Social housing rents will rise by more than inflation over the next decade as part of UK government plans to boost affordable house building and shore up the finances of struggling landlords. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is working on plans to introduce a 10-year formula to calculate social rents on homes that will result in rents increasing every year by the rates of the Consumer Prices Index, which is now 2.2% plus 1%, removing an existing cap on rises. I mean, why won't people think of the landlords? So Labour are going to increase rent for social renters, which, I mean, social housing is typically for those on lower incomes. This will then be used for so-called social housing. Kevin, I mean, who does this actually benefit? I mean, obviously those who have to pay more will lose out. But, I mean, what even is the logic here? I mean, this, to me, seems like it's going to divide people even further.
Yeah, well, this is just Rachel Reeves continuing her George Osborne tribute act, basically. So much for the much vaunted decade of renewal and change that we were promised only, 7 weeks ago now? Good Lord. Yes. The people who will benefit from this are obviously landlords and private developers. Once again, the Labour Party has seen correctly a problem in society and come up with totally the wrong solution to the problem. In fact, this isn't even a solution to the problem, as is so often the case. This is a poor attempt, a very, very poor attempt at trying to equalise the gap between social rented prices and the quote-unquote affordable private sector prices. And the emphasis on the word supposedly in that previous sentence is very deliberate, because they're not affordable, and we know they're not affordable. The problem is that in order for more private housing to be built, they'll often knock down, because they can't build on greenbelt sites and you've got land banking, that'll create a brown site by destroying pre-existing social housing, but promising to build a very small percentage of affordable housing. And local authorities get to set the rate for that, which is often set at the maximum, which is 80% of market rental price, which is twice the amount of social rented, which is 40%. And 40% is already a little bit too high, because we already know that 80% of market rate is ridiculously unaffordable for the vast majority of the poorest in society. So it's not affordable housing at all. What it is government cope. It's pretending that the problem isn't really there. So in order to try and equalise that problem, rather than punishing the people who would force this situation, those at the very top, they're going to force that cost onto the very poorest in society, further ruining it, so adding to the gentrification of areas without even having to knock down the houses, because people won't be able to afford them, and then the local authorities will sell them off and all the rest of it. When George Osborne described Rachel Reeves as mini-me only a few weeks ago, he wasn't wrong, was he? She literally is forcing the very same continuity austerity on us, forcing the poorest in society to pay the financial burden of problems caused by the richest in society. It's Cameronism 2.0.
I mean, with many of the major policies Labour have announced, we've essentially seen Labour push costs onto people instead of footing the bill from the Treasury. I mean, a while ago, there was an £88 billion private investment into water, which was announced by Steve Reeves. And the way they were going to recuperate the costs was through higher bills. Birmingham Council, Labour-held council, sold 750 homes to private companies, where the private sector will obviously use it to make profits, added extra cost to residents. This is essentially the same thing, right? Instead of the government investing in council houses, what they're doing is building houses off the back of people. And in this instance, renters in social housing. You know, these are the sort of people who absolutely do not need more of a burden. And I think is to turn around and say, well, look, we're so good with the finances. The problem is, all right, Labour also promised to make people's standard of living better, which they're also failing to do. So, I mean, why are they doing this? I mean, do they not think that people will notice? I mean, or do they think, okay, well, I'm personally worse off, but don't worry, Rachel Reeves was better at balancing the books than the Tories, so I guess that's all right then.
Well, why Rachel Reeves is doing this is because she is just George Osborne. Like, this is fundamentally the austerity solution, quote unquote, to the situation. So for her, it's a sort of ideological tenet that the poorest all must be made to pay, because the idea that you could in any way affect the huge amount of money being raked in by the leeches of the landlord sector and the leeches of the private equity firms that run all of these building establishments, that's anathema to us. You were never going to allow that to happen. I don't know that Keir Starmer has any knowledge of how finance works at all. It's not a thing he's ever been involved with. We know he had to be given a crash course in economics when he became leader of the party. He's a person of supreme irrelevance when it comes to this. So basically, she's been given free rein to do what she likes, and she's doing the Tory thing because she's a Tory. One tiny glimmer of hope in all of this is the idea that I think a lot of Labour MPs, especially a lot of new Labour MPs in marginal areas, will hopefully behind the scenes put pressure on her and Keir Starmer before the budget to drop this, or to at least severely curtail the situation, because they know this is going to be disastrous for them, because this is just a continuation. This isn't change. This isn't a decade of renewal. This is a deepening of the problem that got them elected in the first place, for which their constituents would quite rightly not ever forgive them if they betrayed them in that way. So hopefully they'll do that, but that relies on two things which the Labour Party have not shown themselves to be in possession of: A, giving a shit, and B, a backbone to stand up against it. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect they won't be able to do that in the long run, because they've got such a massive majority, and so many of the members of Parliament are feckless lackeys.
I mean, Rachel Reeves has boxed herself in with these fiscal rules. So when you talk about some Labour MPs potentially pressuring the government to sort of change tack, I find that quite hard to believe, because it would shatter the illusion that Rachel Reeves has tried to create, which is that, treating the economy as a household budget, and that we can't do certain things because of our fiscal rules or the money isn't there. And as soon as she breaks that rule, because these fiscal rules are absolutely ridiculous, because she may inevitably or will be forced to break that rule, the media are going to ask questions. They're going to say, well, hold on a second, all these things you couldn't do, such as scrapping the 2-child benefit cap, you couldn't do it back then because of your fiscal rules, but now you've been pressured into this. And that's going to expose the Labour Party and Rachel Reeves as liars. I also think what's very striking in terms of this specific policy, what's so striking is that Labour are openly saying they are prioritising landlords over social renters. Now, I'm not surprised that Labour are pro-landlord in policy. They've demonstrated that they back those with more power than those without. I mean, think of all the billionaires that have joined the party in terms of donations. But optically, this isn't a good look. I mean, does this show once again, despite Labour winning a huge landslide, the party are politically incredibly stupid?
Yeah, well, we know that from the fact that their comms during the election was so abysmally poor. They essentially didn't win the election. The Tories committed suicide on a massive scale, and Reform came in to kill them off, basically. We know that there is no massive love for Keir Starmer or his policies whatsoever. He is barely more popular than the man he replaced, Rishi Sunak, in that role. They are politically rather stupid. And that's where I'm hoping that, because they're on a lower level and they would understand the will of their constituents, that MPs will, behind the scenes, again, they're never going to vote against it, because there's no way they're going to revolt against the first budget of a new government, and that's understandable. But one hopes that they have this, just the self-defense instinct to understand that their own backside is on the line. And that the optics of this are so abysmally poor that they'll pressure her into dropping this. And again, as with the fiscal rules, they are obviously stupid, and they've been broken already anyway. You can't have a completely uncosted, indefinite £3 billion a year to Ukraine, which, by the way, I'm absolutely fine with us giving aid to Ukraine. But the point being, you can't have an uncosted, indefinite, that potentially infinite £3 billion a year.
And I would say, in terms of that's
inside a fiscal network, it doesn't make sense.
I mean, that's the failure of the media there, isn't it? Because we would rightly point out that £3 billion every single year to Ukraine. I mean, Keir Starmer made that commitment indefinitely. That's not a costed policy. You and I aren't particularly, against that policy in of itself. But when you're setting these so-called fiscal rules and saying we can't, scrap a policy that keeps children in poverty. But the media aren't then saying, oh, well, look, the Labour Party have scrapped their fiscal rules because it goes on the policy that essentially the entire West supports. A lot of the people in the media support it. And again, I'm not even particularly against that policy myself. But if it was a commitment to let's invest in our public services, increase benefits, for example, or anything else that helps the people, you'll know the media would quite rightly, not quite rightly, sorry, excuse me, quite wrongly attack Labour on it.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Yeah, you'll notice that the fiscal hawks disappear when it comes to money for Ukraine or aid to various countries. We'll talk about Israel a little bit later on, for instance. But yet, when it comes to spending a penny on British schools, British hospitals, rented sector, whatever, they all of a sudden they're shit on absolutely every single penny that gets spent. All the rest of it. And this is the point. When people talk about the budget as being like a household budget, it's ridiculous. We know that's ridiculous because we're literally a sovereign currency issuer, for God's sake. But also, with a household budget, even if we take it out there at face value, with a household budget, one of the best ways of solving the problem is to have extra intake of money. So you work extra hours at work, or you get a better job, or whatever the thing might be. And we have that at our disposal. If we're going to treat it like a household budget, okay, fine. Let's tax the richest. Let's increase the money coming into the household rather than starving. Surely.
Well, I mean, that's a good point, because that's essentially even John McDonnell's plan back in 2017, 2019, was that in a way, I mean, they weren't saying stuff like, oh, we've maxed out the credit card, but was selling their economic package as a household budget, which is, we're going to raise taxes on the wealthy in order to fund these public services. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the truth, but I'm absolutely fine with the Social Democratic Party saying, we're still going to do these popular policies, but we're going to tax the rich for it. And that's the thing. It's such an easy thing to do for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. I mean, if we go all the way back but before the election, when I think it was the first ever head-to-head debate between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and there was like an audience tracker. You could see whether people responded positively or negatively to what the leaders were saying, and it was kind of like that, because there wasn't much. There was nothing inspiring from either the leaders. But when Keir Starmer said we're going to raise taxes on the richest, and obviously that's more in terms of capital gains tax, again, a policy I support. Not enough taxes, and obviously not a wealth tax there. But when he said that line, you saw the sort of audience response shoot up. It's a popular thing to do, and I don't understand why Rachel Reeves won't do it. Well, actually, I'll reframe that. I do understand why she'd do it, because obviously there's a lot of billionaires that are backed the party. Now, what strikes me here is that I'm trying to compare this to Tony Blair. Now, again, I have so many disagreements with New Labour, the way they funded things, for example, but they did fund things. So PFI, I think it was a disaster, but at least they used that capital to put into public services. This, to me, feels incredibly different, that Labour are looking at funding housing on the back of the poorest of society. And all the time, we hear from Blairites or Starmerites that, whatever Labour government we get, it's going to be better than the Tories. They're going to attack the poorest, and all you lefties that won't support Labour, you're just middle class and you're purist in your thinking. Well, I mean, this is an example where Labour are pitting lower income people on social rent against other low income people who are going to need social housing. So this is, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this to me feels like a huge distinction between, Labour today than Blairism back in 97.
Yeah, I think they are to the right in many respects of where Blair was. And I think that, at least in part, can be put down to Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, for all of his faults, and they were many, I think did have something of a social conscience and did want to spend on public projects. And so having him as the Chancellor was enormous in terms of steering that potential course. Whereas we have the exact opposite in Rachel Reeves. Rather than being a bulwark to hold back the worst restraints of Blairism, or Starmerism in this instance, Rachel Reeves is going to nitro power that right-wing nonsense rather than holding it in check. And we could end up with a much further right economically anyway, Labour Party now than we had back in 1997 and beyond. She's an ideologue at the end of the day. When you say she's pitting the poorest in society against, slightly less poorly off, but still relatively poor people in the private sector. This is exactly the Tory game. And this is why I couldn't back Labour at the most recent election, having backed them at previous elections, because there was a harm reduction, right? They were substantially, in some ways, better than the alternative. Whereas actually at this election, they weren't. If we look at this policy, if we look at their immigration rhetoric, if we look at Israel, if we look at virtually everything, they weren't a lesser evil than the Tories. They were just the same evil with a red rosette. And that doesn't mean anything to me or to anyone in the real world.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.